Stop calling yourself a sinner. Those words may seem humble, but if you truly understand what happened at the cross, you will realize that repeating that phrase over yourself is not humility, it is ignorance of redemption. When a man or woman continually calls themselves a sinner after they have come to Christ, they are unknowingly speaking against the very work Jesus finished. They are measuring themselves by their past instead of by the cross. The cross was not a symbol of partial victory. It was the place of a complete exchange. At the cross, Jesus did not merely cover sin for a moment. He dealt with the sin nature itself. He took what humanity was and gave us what he is. That is the miracle of redemption. Religion has taught many believers to stay in the language of defeat. It keeps them saying, "I'm just a sinner saved by grace." But that statement, though common, misses the heart of the gospel. If you were only a sinner saved by grace, then the cross did not transform you. It only tolerated you. Yet the gospel tells us something far greater. Through Christ you were made a new creation. The old man did not receive improvement. The old man died. When Jesus hung on the cross, he was not just dying for you, he was dying as you. Your old identity was crucified there. Think about it. If the old you died with Christ, then why keep introducing yourself by a name that belonged to a person who no longer exists? When a believer keeps saying, "I'm a sinner," they are speaking from memory instead of revelation. They are remembering what they used to be instead of declaring what God says they are now. Many people think the cross was only about forgiveness, but forgiveness alone does not reveal the full power of redemption. If the cross had only provided forgiveness, then humanity would still remain the same inwardly, guilty, weak, and dominated by the old nature. Forgiveness would simply clean the record while leaving the heart unchanged. But the work of Jesus was far greater than that. The cross did not merely deal with what humanity had done, it dealt with what humanity was. When Jesus went to the cross, he did not just carry individual sins like isolated mistakes. He carried the entire sin nature of mankind. He became identified with humanity's spiritual condition. The weight of separation from God, the corruption of the fallen nature, and the consequences of sin were laid upon him. In that moment, Jesus stood in the place of the human race. He took upon himself everything that kept humanity separated from God. This is where many believers misunderstand redemption. They think salvation means God simply forgave them and decided to tolerate them despite their broken condition. But redemption is not God overlooking sin. Redemption is God transforming the sinner. The cross was not God ignoring the problem of sin. It was God destroying it at its root. When Jesus died, the old spiritual condition of the believer was judged and put away. The old identity that was born in spiritual death was nailed to the cross with Christ. In God's eyes, that old person, the one dominated by sin and separated from him, was brought to an end. This is why the gospel speaks about being born again. The phrase itself reveals something powerful. A birth is not a repair, it is the beginning of a new life. When a person is born again, God does not polish the old nature or slowly improve the sinful heart. Instead, he creates something entirely new in the human spirit. That is the miracle of the new creation. Inside the believer, God plants his own life. The very nature that belongs to him is imparted into the human spirit. The person who was once spiritually dead becomes spiritually alive. The person who was once separated from God becomes united with him. This is not symbolic language. It is a real spiritual transformation. The cross made it legally possible, and the resurrection proved that the work was complete. When Jesus rose from the dead, he did not rise as the same man who went into the grave. He rose as the head of a new creation. His victory over sin, death, and Satan opened the door for humanity to receive a completely new life. This means the believer is no longer defined by the past. The old identity that once belonged to them has no authority anymore. That person was crucified with Christ. Yet many believers continue speaking about themselves as though the cross never changed them. They still describe themselves as sinners struggling to approach God. They live with the constant awareness of failure and weakness. But when a person truly understands what happened at the cross, their perspective begins to shift. They realize that God did not simply erase their sins and send them back into life unchanged. Instead, He recreated their spirit so that they could live in fellowship with Him. Think about the depth of this transformation. Before redemption, humanity lived in spiritual darkness. The human spirit was separated from the life of God. No amount of effort, discipline, or religion could bridge that gap. Humanity needed more than moral improvement. Humanity needed a new nature. That is exactly what Jesus came to provide. Through His sacrifice, the barrier between God and humanity was removed. When a person receives Christ, something supernatural happens within them. The Spirit of God brings new life to their spirit. The nature of God replaces the old spiritual condition. The believer becomes a new creation. This truth changes everything about how a person sees themselves. If the old life has been crucified and a new life has been given, then the believer must begin to see themselves through the lens of redemption, rather than through the memory of their past. The cross was not weak. It did not produce a partial result. It accomplished exactly what God intended, to bring humanity out of spiritual death and into spiritual life. Imagine a man who was once imprisoned but has been completely set free. If he continues living as though he is still a prisoner, the problem is not his freedom, the problem is his understanding. The door has been opened, but his thinking has not yet caught up with the reality of his new condition. In the same way, many believers have experienced the new birth, but still think like the old person they used to be. They keep measuring themselves by their failures rather than by the work Christ finished. But faith begins when a person accepts God's view of redemption. Faith says, "If God says I am a new creation, then I believe it." Faith declares that the cross accomplished what human effort never could. This understanding produces confidence in the heart of the believer. Instead of constantly struggling under the weight of guilt, they begin to live from the life God placed within them. They start realizing that their relationship with God is not based on their past, but on the finished work of Jesus. And this is the glory of redemption. God did not simply forgive humanity and leave them in weakness. He recreated them so they could live in fellowship with Him. The cross was not just the place where sins were removed. It was the place where a new humanity began. When a believer sees this truth clearly, they stop defining themselves by what they used to be. They begin to recognize the miracle that took place within them. The old life is gone, and the new life of God has begun. The moment Jesus went to the cross, something far deeper happened than what the natural eye could see. To many people it appeared to be only the execution of a man. But in the realm of the Spirit, God was carrying out the greatest act of redemption the world has ever known. The cross was not only the suffering of Christ, it was the place where the old identity of humanity was brought to an end. From the beginning of the fall of man, humanity carried within it a nature that was separated from God. That fallen nature shaped the way people thought, lived, and responded to life. Sin was not only something people occasionally did, it was the condition of the human spirit. It ruled the inner life and kept mankind in spiritual darkness. No human effort could change that condition. Laws could restrain behavior. Religion could encourage discipline, and morality could improve conduct, but none of those things could remove the old nature. The problem was not on the surface of humanity, It was rooted deep within the spirit. This is why the mission of Jesus was not simply to teach good principles or to inspire people to live better lives. His mission was to deal with the root of the problem. He came to do what humanity could never accomplish on its own. When Jesus went to the cross, he stood as the representative of the entire human race. He identified himself with humanity so completely that he took upon himself the consequences of the fallen condition. The judgment that belonged to the old humanity was placed upon him. In that moment, the cross became more than a place of suffering. It became the place where the old man was crucified. The old man represents the identity that existed before redemption. It is the person shaped by sin, dominated by spiritual death, and separated from the life of God. That identity had ruled humanity since the fall of Adam. But when Christ was crucified, God included humanity in that event. The old nature was judged and brought to an end through the death of Jesus. In God's sight, the believer's old identity was nailed to the cross with Christ. This truth is powerful because it reveals that redemption is not just about forgiveness, it is about identification. Jesus did not simply die for humanity in a distant way. He died as the representative of humanity so that what happened to him could become the believer's reality. When he died, the old man died with him. When he was buried, the old life was buried as well. And when he rose from the dead, a new life became available for everyone who believes. This is the heart of the new creation. The believer is not simply someone who has been forgiven while remaining the same inside. The believer is someone whose old identity has been replaced by a new one. Yet many people struggle to understand this. They look at their weaknesses, their mistakes, and their struggles and assume that they are still the same person they were before they came to Christ. Because they still see imperfections in their behavior, they assume the old nature must still define them. But redemption works deeper than behavior. The transformation begins in the spirit. The spirit of a person is the core of who they are. When a person receives the life of God, that inner core is recreated. The believer becomes a new creation. This means the old identity no longer has the authority it once had. It has already been crucified with Christ. The habits of the past may still try to influence the mind and the body, but the true identity of the believer has already been changed. Think about the significance of that truth. If the old man truly died with Christ, then the believer is not fighting to destroy their old identity. That work has already been accomplished through the cross. The challenge many believers face is not the absence of victory, but the absence of understanding. They continue to think of themselves as the same person they were before salvation. Their minds remain tied to the memory of their past rather than the reality of their new life. But faith begins when a person accepts God's declaration about their identity. God says the old man was crucified with Christ. That means the believer does not need to carry the weight of that old life anymore. The cross settled the issue. The enemy, however, constantly tries to remind believers of their past. He whispers accusations that say nothing has really changed. He points to failures and weaknesses and tries to convince them that they are still the same person they used to be. But those accusations ignore the power of the cross. The cross was not a temporary solution. It was the decisive moment where the authority of the old nature was broken. Through the sacrifice of Jesus, the power that once ruled humanity lost its claim over the believer. Now the believer stands in a new position. Instead of being defined by the fallen nature, they are defined by their union with Christ. Their identity is no longer rooted in Adam, but in Jesus. They belong to a new family and carry a new nature. This understanding changes the way a person approaches life. Instead of constantly struggling under the weight of guilt and condemnation, They begin to realize that God sees them through the work of Christ. They begin to understand that the old life has already been judged and removed. The cross was not only the place where Jesus suffered, it was the place where the old humanity came to its end. The person who once lived separated from God was crucified there, and through the resurrection, a completely new identity became available for those who believe. The believer is no longer the person they once were. Their past no longer defines their future. Something entirely new has begun through the work of Christ. One of the greatest struggles many believers face is not the lack of faith, but the constant awareness of their own failure. Their thoughts are filled with memories of mistakes, weaknesses, and shortcomings. They come before God feeling small, unworthy, and uncertain. Instead of seeing themselves through the finished work of Christ, they see themselves through the lens of their past behavior. This condition is what can be called sin consciousness, and it quietly drains the strength out of a believer's faith. Sin consciousness is the habit of focusing on sin, failure, and unworthiness as the central truth about oneself. It is when a person constantly measures their relationship with God by their imperfections. Every prayer begins with hesitation. Every step forward is slowed by the fear of failure. Instead of confidence, there is constant self-examination and doubt. This mindset did not begin with the gospel. It began in the fall of humanity. When the first humans became aware of their separation from God, they immediately became conscious of their shame. They hid from God because they saw themselves as unworthy of His presence. That sense of distance became part of the human experience for generations. People believed God was far away and that they had to struggle endlessly to reach Him. The law that came later revealed sin clearly, but it did not remove it. The law functioned like a mirror that showed humanity its condition. It exposed weakness, but it did not have the power to transform the heart. As a result, people became even more aware of their shortcomings. But the purpose of redemption was to end that cycle. The work of Christ did not simply make forgiveness available while leaving people trapped in constant guilt. The cross was meant to bring believers into a new relationship with God, where confidence could replace fear. Yet many believers still live with the mindset that belonged to the time before redemption. They continue to approach God as though they are outsiders trying to earn acceptance. Their prayers are filled with hesitation. Their faith feels weak because they constantly question whether they are worthy to receive anything from God. Faith cannot grow strong in a heart that is dominated by condemnation. When a person believes they are unworthy, they will struggle to believe that God truly desires to bless them, guide them, or work through them. Their focus remains on their failures instead of on God's grace. This is why sin consciousness weakens faith. Faith thrives where there is confidence in God's acceptance. When a believer knows that the barrier between them and God has been removed, their heart becomes bold. They approach God not as someone begging for mercy, but as someone who knows they belong in His presence. Confidence in God does not come from human perfection. It comes from understanding what Christ accomplished. The cross changed the relationship between God and those who believe. Through redemption, the believer was brought into right standing with God. Right standing means that the issue of sin has already been dealt with through Jesus. The believer is no longer defined by guilt or separation. Instead, they stand before God in the righteousness that Christ provided. When this truth begins to take root in a person's heart, their entire outlook begins to change. They no longer live under the constant pressure of trying to prove themselves worthy. They realize that their acceptance before God was established by the sacrifice of Jesus. This realization frees the heart from the grip of condemnation. Instead of focusing on failure, the believer begins focusing on the life God has placed within them. They begin to see themselves as someone who has been redeemed and restored. The voice of guilt loses its power when the voice of redemption becomes louder. The enemy understands how powerful this shift is, which is why he constantly tries to keep believers trapped in sin consciousness. If he can keep their attention fixed on their weaknesses, he can keep their faith small. When a person is always thinking about their failures, they rarely step forward with confidence. But when a believer becomes righteousness conscious instead of sin conscious, something powerful begins to happen. Righteousness consciousness means becoming aware of the new position that Christ has given. It means recognizing that the believer now stands accepted before God. It means understanding that the relationship with God is not built on personal performance, but on the finished work of Jesus. This awareness changes the way a person prays. Prayer stops feeling like an uncertain attempt to reach a distant God. Instead, it becomes a conversation with a Father who has already welcomed them. It also changes the way a person approaches life. Instead of expecting failure, they begin to expect growth. Instead of seeing themselves as weak and defeated, they begin to recognize the life of God working within them. Faith becomes stronger because the foundation of faith shifts from human ability to divine grace. A believer who understands righteousness is not careless about their actions. In fact, the opposite is true. When someone knows they have been accepted and transformed by God, gratitude begins to shape their choices. Their desire to live rightly grows from love rather than from fear. This is why the gospel does not weaken moral living, it strengthens it. When people live under constant guilt, they often feel trapped in cycles of failure. But when they understand the new life God has given them, they begin to rise above those patterns. The cross was meant to set believers free from the constant burden of condemnation. The awareness of sin was never meant to dominate the life of someone who has been redeemed. Instead, believers were meant to live with the awareness that they have been brought into a new relationship with God. They were meant to walk with confidence, knowing that the barrier of sin has already been removed through the work of Christ. When that truth becomes real in the heart, faith grows stronger, prayer becomes more confident, and the believer begins to live from the strength of the new life God has given them. One of the most powerful truths a believer can discover is that righteousness is not something they are trying to earn, but something they have already received through Jesus Christ. For many people, righteousness sounds like a distant goal, something reserved for those who have achieved a high level of holiness or spiritual discipline. They imagine righteousness as a reward for perfect behavior, something that must be slowly earned through years of effort. But the message of redemption reveals something far more wonderful than that. Righteousness in the gospel is a gift. It is the position God gives to those who believe in Christ. It is not the result of human effort, and it is not built on personal achievements. It is the result of what Jesus accomplished through his death and resurrection. Before redemption, humanity lived in separation from God. The human spirit was marked by spiritual death, and because of that condition, no person could stand before God with confidence. Even the most disciplined and moral individuals knew that they could never reach the level of holiness that God required. There was always a sense of distance between humanity and the Creator. This is why the work of Christ was necessary. Jesus did not come merely to give better instructions about how to live. He came to restore the broken relationship between God and humanity. Through the cross, he took upon himself the consequences of sin and opened the way for a completely new standing before God. When a person receives Christ, something remarkable happens in the Spirit. God declares that person righteous. This declaration is not symbolic. It is a real legal and spiritual position. The believer is placed in right standing with God because of the finished work of Jesus. Right standing means that the barrier between God and the believer has been removed. The issue of guilt has already been dealt with through the sacrifice of Christ. The believer is no longer viewed through the lens of past sin, but through the righteousness that Jesus provides. This truth changes the way a believer approaches God. Instead of coming with fear and hesitation, they can come with confidence. They are not standing on their own record, but on the perfect work of Christ. Confidence in God's presence is not arrogance. It is faith in what God has done. When a believer understands righteousness, they realize that their relationship with God is secure because it is built on something far greater than their personal performance. This understanding also brings freedom from the constant struggle to prove oneself worthy. Many believers spend years trying to earn the approval of God through their actions. They work harder, pray longer, and try to be more disciplined, hoping that eventually they will feel accepted. But righteousness reveals that acceptance was already given through Christ. The believer does not work to gain God's approval. They live from the approval that redemption has already provided. This shift changes everything about the spiritual life. Instead of striving to become something, the believer begins to live out what they already are in Christ. Their actions begin to flow from their identity rather than from pressure or fear. When a person knows they have been made righteous, their heart becomes bold in prayer. They approach God as someone who belongs in His presence. They understand that the door between them and the Father is permanently open because of Jesus. Prayer becomes more than a desperate request for mercy. It becomes a confident conversation between a child and their Father. The believer knows they are welcomed, heard, and valued. Righteousness also brings authority into the life of the believer. The person who understands their position in Christ realizes that they are not powerless in the spiritual realm. They have been brought into partnership with God's purposes on the earth. This authority does not come from human strength or spiritual pride. It comes from the believer's union with Christ. Because they are connected to Him, they share in the victory that He achieved. When Jesus rose from the dead, He overcame sin, death, and the powers of darkness. That victory was not meant to remain distant from believers. Through redemption, they were brought into that victory. The believer who understands righteousness begins to live differently. Instead of constantly feeling defeated by circumstances, they begin to stand in the confidence that God is with them and working through them. Their words change. Their expectations change. Their perspective changes. They begin to see themselves not as weak individuals trying to survive, but as children of God who carry His life within them. This understanding also transforms the way a believer views their daily struggles. When mistakes happen, they no longer collapse under the weight of guilt. Instead, they remember that their standing with God is based on Christ, not on their momentary failures. This does not encourage carelessness. Rather, it strengthens the desire to live in a way that reflects the new life God has given. Gratitude begins to shape the believer's choices. Love for God becomes the motivation for growth and obedience. The life of righteousness is not a life of pressure, it is a life of transformation. The believer grows into the reality of what God has already declared about them. They learn to walk in the identity that redemption has given. This is the beauty of the gospel. God did not simply rescue humanity from punishment. He restored humanity to a position of fellowship, dignity, and purpose. Through Christ, believers were brought into right standing with the Creator of the universe. And when that truth becomes real in the heart, it produces confidence, joy, and a sense of belonging that changes the entire direction of a person's life. So stop speaking the language of your old life. Stop repeating what you were. Start declaring what God says you are. You are redeemed. You are forgiven. You are a new creation. You are righteous through Christ. And every time you declare that truth, you honor the cross.